Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you watch this. Welcome to the School of International Affairs at the George Washington University here in Washington, D.C., and to the Rethinking Capitalism and Democracy virtual event series. My name is Remy Jedbab. I'm Director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP, as we like to call it. I'm delighted to welcome you to a great lineup of speakers and discussants to learn more about the theme of the event. In a moment, I will turn the podium over to my colleague at IIEP, Sunil Sharma. But first, I want to thank IIEP and our executive circle supporters for helping make today's event possible, and to our IIEP staff for the support of the conference. For those of you who don't know us, IIEP is located here at the Elliott School, and we are an interdisciplinary research center. We aim to serve as a catalyst for high-quality research on policy issues surrounding economic globalization. And that is a mandate that we interpret rather broadly. So this includes international trade, international finance, development economics, poverty studies, climate change, and economic policy more broadly. We have had quite a focus on both China's economy and India's economy over the last number of years. It is now my pleasure to turn over the podium to Sunil. Sunil, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Let me add my welcome to Remy. Welcome, everybody. This is the 15th seminar in the series on rethinking capitalism and democracy. The series is focused on systemic issues, and today's topic is capitalism, democracy, and governance. I don't know how more systemic we can get. Capitalism and democracy had a successful marriage for a number of decades. The last few decades of this union have been difficult. Today's seminar will examine the frictions in the marriage and what can be done to make it agreeable again. So let me say a few words. So let's start by asking what underpins a strong marriage of the two. First, fair elections, access to the ballot box, and open-minded struggle of ideas that translates public preferences into good governance and policy, ideally. Second, shared prosperity. A set of political, government, market, and social institutions that produce shared prosperity. Third, a degree of political and economic equality that prevents tyranny of the elite or any other group. Trust in the system that makes people believe in the rules of the game and the outcomes. That is a degree of legitimacy and accountability. A public square that allows for a collective discussion of issues, problems, and grievances, and the examination of policy options. And six, last but not least, I should mention a reasonably stable and healthy natural environment, which till now we've taken for granted, and that is now deteriorating. Inequality, economic insecurity, political and social divisiveness, declining social capital, and a deteriorating natural environment are threatening to upend norms and institutions that have allowed democratic capitalism to prosper for a number of decades. This is not just about the future, but I think it's really about the here and now. I give you a selected headlines from today's Washington Post. Front page, Trump in New York to face criminal charges, a red-blue divide in higher education, future of abortion in Wisconsin may rest on costly race. The op-ed pages, how to rig an election with deadly racist consequences. Fox is not a news network, but a propaganda outlet. We can learn from the war against the Klan 100 years ago. Today, we have a stellar panel to examine the situation. Martin Wolf is Associate Editor and Chief Economics Correspondent at the Financial Times. He is widely considered to be one of the world's preeminent financial journalists. He was a senior economist at the World Bank and Director of Studies of the Trade Policy Research Center in London. In 2000, Martin was awarded the CBE, the Commander of the Order of the British Empire. Martin has honorary doctoral degrees from LSE, Nottingham, and Catholic University Leuven. He won the Winnicott Foundation Senior Prize for Excellence in Financial Journalism in '89 and '97, the David Watt Memorial Prize in 1994, and Gerald Loeb Lifetime Achievement Award from UCLA's Anderson School of Management in 2019. He's written a number of very highly regarded books, The Shifts and the Shocks, Why Globalization Works, and Fixing Global Finance. His latest book, which I highly recommend, is The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, just released by Penguin Books in 2023. Our other speaker is Dr. Joe Zammit-Lucia, who is an advisor to business leaders, an author, a public speaker, and a commentator on business and politics. His executive experience spans research and development, marketing, global brand management, strategic planning, general management, industry economics, and public policy. He founded his own management consulting firm with offices in Cambridge, New York, and Tokyo. He's a founder of RADIX, a public policy think tank, and the RADIX Center for Business, Politics, and Society. He's on the advisory board of the Singapore Forum for Long-Term Investors and Business Leaders, and an external advisor to the CE World magazine. He served as special advisor at the International Union for Conservation of Nature and on the Dean's Advisory Board of the College of Arts, Sciences, and Education at Florida International University. His latest book is The New Political Capitalism: How Businesses and Societies Can Thrive in a Deeply Politicized World, by Bloomsbury Press, 2022. His previous books have included The Death of Liberal Democracy and Backlash, Saving Globalization from Itself. His book, I also highly recommend to everybody who is listening. Our discussant today is Dr. Ann Florini. She's a fellow in the Political Reform Program at New America, a think tank in Washington, DC, working on governance tools that can address the intertwined challenges of climate change and democratic decay. She's also affiliated with Arizona State University, a founding board member of the Economics of Mutuality Foundation, and a founding member of the Council on Economic Policies in Zurich. She has held senior appointments at the Brookings Institution and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Ann has taught at the National University of Singapore, where she founded and led the Center on Asia and Globalization, and at the Singapore Management University, where she created and ran the master's program in tri-sector collaboration. Her books and articles have addressed innovations in governance, China's governance, transparency and information flows in governance, the roles of civil society and the private sector in addressing public problems, and climate and energy policy. We're truly fortunate to have the panel today. And with that, let me hand the floor to Martin. Martin, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much for the invitation. I think I've been asked to talk for about 10 minutes, which can obviously be no more than a tiny taster of what I argue in this rather large book. Let me start, before I present it, with why I wrote this book. This book took me well out of my normal comfort zone as an economic commentator, and it took me all the way back to what I studied at university a very long time ago, when I read first classics and then politics, philosophy, and economics before doing graduate studies in economics. And it forced me to think very, very carefully about the relationship between democracy and capitalism, which is obviously the theme here. And I think that was fruitful, at least for me. Why did I do so? Well, I think that's pretty clear. I started this book in 2016. It took me a long time to sort through what I thought about it. And of course, the world changed all the time, endlessly, but generally in a direction that was helpful to my cause, if not to my book, if not helpful to the world. But the underlying theme was very clearly the awareness that some very big things were happening in the world to democracies and democratic institutions, not just in developing and emerging countries which had relatively recently shifted to democratic political systems from the 80s onwards, but even to core democratic countries, where basically one took for granted that democratic institutions and values were fully consolidated. I'm thinking, of course, of the US and in a different way, the UK, but you can see very similar forces go at work in quite a large number of large developed countries. France and Italy come at once to mind. And that's associated, of course, with the rise of populism in both its anti-elite forms, anti-elitist forms, and its anti-pluralist forms, the more malign version of populism, which is highly anti-pluralist. And we can see both of these phenomena, both aspects of populism very clearly in all these countries. And the question that I addressed in the book is, why is this happening? What are the forces behind it? And I focus particularly, being this being my comparative advantage on economic forces, which I think have played an enormous role, and what can be done about it. I'm going to leave the last completely to one side because to the later discussion, but let me just show you a little bit about what I think about the what's going on. I hope very much you can see this. So this is my, that's my book, and in the UK version, by the way, and the red, of course, indicates where the split is occurring. Now, I have a quotation which I found in the course of researching this book, which I think catches the theme Sunil introduced very, very well. And it comes from, well, surprise, surprise, Aristotle's Politics, the second great book in the Western tradition of political science. The other one, I think, being pretty clearly Plato's Republic. And what he says is, it is clear then that the best partnership in a state is the one in which operates through middle people, or by which he means the middle class. And also that those states in which the middle element is large and stronger, if possible, than the other two together, by which he meant the extremely rich, the oligarchs or the plutocrats on the one hand and the very poor on the other, or at any rate stronger than either of them alone, have every chance of having a well-run constitution. Basically, Aristotle is saying you need a strong, vibrant, self-confident middle class if you are going to maintain a democratic system that works. And I suppose if we're going to think of places where that hasn't worked so well, many of us would think of quite a number of Latin American countries with a very powerful but small plutocracy and a very, very large number of really poor and relatively insecure people. And my other quote is a sort of real motto for my book. What I think has happened is that the balance of our societies has gone fundamentally wrong by virtue of an excessive shift towards what I think in America might be called libertarian economics. Basically, we ignored the consequences of free markets in certain respects, and particularly the predatory consequences of unbridled free markets. And my quote is another famous Greek quote, which is mer dan agan, which means nothing in excess. Basically, we have to rebalance it. Now, let me just go through a few slides which illustrate the sort of core of the argument. The first is, this comes from Freedom House a few years ago. It's their estimate of the state of democracy, the health of democracy at that time. And I think what was striking to me, really disturbing to me, is just how low they placed the US. This, of course, was in the middle of the Trump term. It hasn't got better since then. And this reflects, again, points Sunil made, that the most fundamental processes of democracy, the legitimacy of elections, the acceptance of the outcome of elections, the functioning of media, whose conclusions about the truth, the facts, are broadly accepted. All this is in debate in the US. And in that situation, as I argue in my book, democracy starts becoming a civil war. And when democracy starts becoming a civil war, you don't know whether the outcomes of elections will be accepted. And actual war or outright autocracy is a permanent threat. And that's, of course, happened in very many countries in recent decades. Now, this realization of where we were today sort of encouraged me to go back to look at the history of democracy and develop some ideas about it. So in this particular chart, which is, I think, rather interesting, though I don't want to overdo it, but the brown line is in a way the most interesting. It shows the proportion of the world's countries that had plausibly democratic governments, not perfectly democratic governments, governments in which were elected by votes, in which there was a pretty wide suffrage, not universal, but pretty wide suffrage of adults. And those elections actually worked. And of course, it is worth noting this is the proportion of countries in the world that The number of countries has, of course, increased dramatically in the last 70 years as the empires were dismantled. And the big point here, however, is among the countries, smaller, of course, before then, back in 1870, they think 10% of the world's countries were democratic. In the year 1800, it was 0. There were no democracies at all. This peaked just after the First World War, when there was a big increase in the number of democracies as empires in Europe collapsed. But then there was the interwar crisis, the rise of fascism, and the complete collapse in the 40s of democratic government in large parts of the world. After the Second World War, there was a recovery and then a long, slow retreat as a large proportion of the new independent countries became autocratic, and then a huge upswing until about 10 years ago. And after that, actually, though the data does not show it, it's in decline. And I show, which I think is interesting, that periods of buoyant markets, as measured here by the growth of world trade, it's just an indicator of it, actually coincided with the upswings of democracy reasonably well. And the collapse of democracy in the 20s, 30s, and 40s coincided with economic disaster, inward-looking, nationalist, often authoritarian regimes, poor economic performance, and all the rest of it. Now, more broadly, I would just argue that this raises the question, obviously, of how democracy and market economies go together. And I'll just make a few propositions, which are assertions. I regard the capitalist system, by which I'm...
Well, while we wait for him, that was an interesting chart, I thought.
Yes, yes.
And it's a question of whether, as with all such correlations, which way the causality flows. Is it that democracies become more prosperous, or is it that if you're prosperous, it's easier to sustain a democracy?
Or there are other underlying causes of both that push in the direction.
Yeah.
I think the point of the graph is like this is mean income and not median income. So it doesn't tell us anything about inequality or the income of a lower middle class. So,
which I think actually raises another book that I have been finding very interesting. Robert Putnam has a book out a couple of years ago called Upswing, which is trying to tease together exactly those kinds of questions of things go right in general, and then they go wrong in general. And his argument is that you cannot really distinguish causes. What you have is an interpolation of many different kinds of factors that all tend to move us in the same direction. A lot of us are grappling with these kinds of very complex questions.
Well, it's good that we're grappling with them rather than pretending we know the causality.
Yes.
This is an area in which policy people and social scientists are rediscovering humility.
Right.
Apologies to the audience. We were saying just before we started, there are always technical glitches, even after 3 years of incessantly doing this. So our apologies. We'll get Martin back soon, and then we will switch to Joe.
Okay.
I am very looking forward to engaging in the conversation with all of you. And perhaps if we're going to be having some trouble getting him back, Joe, do you want to just go ahead and start?
Yes.
Sure.
Joe, why don't you start, and then we'll get Martin back.
Sounds good. Okay, thank you very much. So as Sunil mentioned, what I'm going to talk about is the thesis of my book, which is quite different from Martin's. First of all, in terms of the title. So I prefer the term political capitalism rather than democratic capitalism, and I'll talk why. I'll say why in a minute. And my book is focused more narrowly. Martin's book takes a very broad picture of what's going on and then puts forward essentially a political statement of, what he suggests might be ways forward. My book is more focused on the role of business in our society and how the new political capitalism affects that. In other words, what I'm saying is not what we should do, but in terms of the world is changing in this way. And if you want to thrive, both as a business and in terms of our societies, then you need to adapt. So that's the thesis of my book. But seeing as it's got the words political and capitalism, maybe we should start by, I should start at least by saying what I mean by those two words. Because every time you speak to business people and use the word politics, you tend to get a roll of the eyes and a sigh and people turning in a different direction because of this belief that has somehow grown up that business and politics have nothing to do with each other. So political capitalism, and let's see if I can. So what is politics? So I define politics as the system or the processes by which we decide what sort of society we want to live in. And taking from a wonderful little booklet that everybody should read called In Defense of Politics by Bernard Crick. It's the difference between a democracy and an autocracy is that in an autocracy, there is no politics because there is no popular debate about what sort of society we want to live in. It's decided by the regime. This is the sort of society we want to live in. So, you know, we have to have politics in order to have democracy. And of course, democracy comes in many forms and is a bit of a fungible term, which is why I prefer the term politics. So it's the mechanism by which we decide what sort of society we want to live in. And the process of politics is finding an inevitably highly imperfect way forward when everyone in the country wants something different, which makes politics very difficult. I mean, as Einstein said, politics is much more difficult than physics. And in my experience, politics is much more difficult than almost anything else I've ever been engaged in. We have to find a balance, inevitably highly imperfect, when every citizen almost is pulling you in a different direction, when all interests are conflicting. And that's a very difficult thing to do. And business, of course, has a big role because business has a big impact on the type of society in which we live, from how much people earn to security of employment to all sorts of things that business, to the provision of finance, everything that business done has a huge impact on the kind of society in which we live. So the idea that business is somehow apolitical is and has always been nonsensical. And as Martin was outlining, of course, I don't need to tell anybody that the world has changed. And what has changed, in my view, is that throughout the late 20th century, we went through a period of time kind of evolving from post-war to the beginning of the 21st century, where there was a broad consensus, whether we liked it or not, on what kind of world we want to live in. The kind of neoliberal ideology had become ascendant. There was political debate, but the window of that political debate was actually fairly narrow. Now, that system is coming to the end of its life. We know it's not working as well as it was. Martin had a slide saying, avoid excess or something. And I think, that system has gone to a system of excess. So now we're in the process of change, and the window of political debate has exploded, and not necessarily a civilized way. The second question, if we understand, is what is politics? The question is, what is capitalism? These are words that we all use. In my book, I use a very, very simple definition of capitalism, which is the right of people to own private capital. And that inevitably leads you to having a market system and a mixed economy. But the other issue, the other thing about capitalism is that it's proven to be highly adaptable and changes all the time. So we've had feudal capitalism, we've had mercantilist capitalism characterized by protectionism and the idea of zero-sum economy. We've had industrial capitalism with the concentration of, with the start of the concentration of wealth. And then we had the post-war consumer capitalism. And now we're in what most people would recognize as financialized capitalism, where, you know, a lot of economic activity no longer takes place within industry, but actually takes place just within the financial system. And everything we do is measured almost exclusively in financial terms. And the other evolution that we've had through this time, of course, was this process of globalization. And that, if you like, took flight with the dropping of capital controls and the very rapid movement of globalized finance across the world. And the impact of that has been what I call a fracture of the political economy. We talk about politics, we talk about economics, but these two are to an extent one and the same. And the phrase political economy has, for some reason, fallen out of favor. And it's something that I and others would like to revive. And the reason I say our political economy is fractured is because politics has remained a national endeavor or a subnational endeavor. The polities, the people who vote, are voting for national political, for their national political structures. Whereas our economies have become global and have transcended the national. So there has been this fracture between how the economy operates and how our politics operates. And in my view, that has been extremely destructive. It's created this competition, this arbitrage, this playing off of one country against another, making it much more difficult to have cohesion and a well-functioning political economy. And of course, this has raised a question which we thought we had had the answer to, which is, what is business for? In our world, what is business for? And, you know, the traditional answer has been, since the 1970s, that it's about maximizing shareholder value, basically making as much money as possible. That was seen as the role of business. Well, that is no longer how we see it. In fact, this view has become obsolete, in my view, and we now understand that business is not something that lives out there separate from society. It's embedded in society, and increasingly we expect that business has an important socio-political cultural role which goes beyond quarterly earnings and stock price performance. And that is a significant change for business over the last, I would say, which has been growing over the last 20 years. And as a result of which, business is now increasingly caught in the crossfire between different political perspectives. But how have we responded to this? Well, the way we've responded to this is by generating a whole alphabet soup of things that business should be taking into account. So we've had CSR, we have ESGs, you're supposed to comply with the SDGs, you're supposed to do something about climate and biodiversity, you're supposed to focus on sustainability, you're now stakeholder focused, not shareholder focused, you're supposed to have purpose, what's your role in democracy, you should take a stand on this or should not take a stand. It's all very confusing. And business people are confused, and it wouldn't surprise me if out of all this alphabet soup, the only thing they remember is something like this. What on earth is going on, and how are we supposed to cope with all of this? So the question is, in the world of political capitalism, how do we thrive in such an environment? And of course, as Martin mentioned, our political economy is the interaction of multiple players in that economy. government, private enterprise. And although a lot of us complain about the arrival of social media and all the downsides of that, there are also lots of benefits in what's going on, because more people, particularly in civil society and citizens, now have a voice. The system isn't serving everybody, but to Martin's previous point about a middle class having a bigger voice than the extremes, I think the potential for that is now much greater than it used to be. So we have all these groups interacting and pulling in different directions. But as the window of political debate has exploded, we find ourselves in this volatile, emotional, highly complex situation, which is, not comfortably linear. It's highly unpredictable and full of the unexpected. And of course, business people don't like that. And how do you cope with that? We also find ourselves, the businesses now are finding themselves in the same state as politics have always found itself, which is that there is no right answer to any issue. Everything is a fudge. Everything is imperfect. And in business terms, that's not very comfortable. Most businesses are used to a highly analytical approach, very complex models and spreadsheets that somehow spit out the right answer. And when you find yourself in a world which is political, then you have to get used to the idea that there is never a right answer. There's only the imperfect way forward that somehow works. Finally, we've learned, or we're becoming more aware, that business has primarily focused on its financial capital. In a world where your role is supposed to be maximizing profits and maximizing shareholder value, then the only capital that matters is financial. But we also now realize that business generates or destroys many other forms of capital, be it human capital, be it social capital, be it political capital, institutional capital, environmental capital, and I could go on. And increasingly, we're asking businesses to account for that, to realize that they are using all these different forms of capital, and that they're creating some and they're destroying others, and that they need to account for that. And I look forward to the day when there's just as much teaching in business schools around social, political, environmental, and institutional capital as there is about finance. But I think we're quite a long way away from that. But all this has changed how we see business as part of our political capitalist society. We see business now as increasingly a very important political actor that has big impacts on the society in which we live, and that has to behave in that way. And of course, we all know that there is a tussle going on, as is always the case when systems are changing, that people are pushing back on this idea, just like people pushed back when business said that the abolition of slavery was anti-business and we didn't want it. So any kind of what we might call progress, and we can define what that, that always changes what it is, will have reactionary forces, and we're seeing those at play. And we have to go through this process, and we'll see where we end up.
Thanks,
so I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Joe. Anne, Kyle, do we have Martin back?
No, we do not.
Okay.
But I would suggest that we continue with Ann's remarks.
Great. Anne, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you. I do hope Martin gets to rejoin us soon. But in the meantime, thanks very much for the opportunity to discuss the themes of these two very important books. Let me echo Sunil's opening comments about urging people to read these. They are major contributions to the debate. What they give us is different takes on why we never should have separated how we think about, you can say, democracy and capitalism, states and markets, politics and economics, governments and business, all different takes on this fundamental marriage between the fundamental means of social organization. So there's a lot of dualities in this conversation that are essentially, for better or worse, married. Both of the books look to the massive but essential challenge of reconfiguring these relationships.
It's Joe Zammit-Lucia. You seem to have dropped off.
Okay,
Joe.
That's fine. So what I'd like to do is look at some of these challenges about why these relationships have gone so badly awry and suggest some approaches to solutions. I'm going to be picking up on some of the points in the books and also in Joe's presentation and expand the conversation a bit around 3 C's: capitals, which Joe just ended on talking about, complexity, and civil society and citizenship. And Martin ends his book with a big focus on the role of citizenship. So as Joe said, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of capital. And we have set up societies that have focused almost exclusively on financial and human capital, development of human capital, both of which are absolutely crucial. Quite possibly the most important form of capital is one that has been badly depleted of late, which is social capital. All the patterns of relationships and trust that make it possible to do things in a human society. You have to have the cross-cutting relationships, the patterns of trust, which in complex societies like ours have to go across all sorts of different types of groups. And that has been severely depleted. In addition, we also have natural capital. And I want to spend a moment talking about that and actually start sharing my screen and bring up a couple of slides because it's a little hard to describe this otherwise. We are utterly dependent as a species, as is all life on the planet, on a whole series of natural planetary cycles that we are disrupting so badly that we're actually threatening the future, not of just civilization, but of millions of species as well. There's a notion of what you can call planetary boundaries, that human civilization started off in this safe operating space that nature had given us, about a certain kind of carbon cycle, a certain kind of nitrogen cycle, a certain degree of environmental biodiversity, et cetera, and that it is actually possible quantitatively to calculate what is that safe operating space that we know humanity can thrive in, because that is the safe operating space within which human civilization emerged. Remember that humanity's been around in its modern form for 200,000–300,000 years. But we've only seen these very complex civilizations much more recently. And that's because Mother Nature happened to line up all of its natural cycles in a way that gave us several thousand years of this safe operating space. We've heard a whole lot about climate change as being a planetary boundary that we have exceeded in the ways that we've disrupted the carbon cycle. But that's not even the worst of them. The nitrogen cycle, with all the fertilizers that we have put out there, are creating vast dead zones in oceans. We've heard a lot about biosphere integrity, the extinctions per million species per year, happening at a phenomenal rate, 1,000 times faster than the normal background rate. This question of novel entities that you see at the top there is the 100,000 or so chemicals that we have introduced mostly since the 1950s without ever testing any of them for their environmental consequences, their impacts on human health, much less how they interact with each other. And we have done all of this mostly within the last 70 or 80 years, and almost entirely since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So we have been investing in human and financial capital, but we've been depleting social and natural capital at quite an appalling rate. And so in thinking about how we have a stable future, democratic capitalism going forward, we have to be thinking about how we regenerate these forms of capital. The second C is complexity, which Joe talks about extensively in his book. The idea that there are so many interacting parts that you cannot in any linear fashion predict what is going to come out. There may be underlying rules, but that doesn't help you understand what the future is going to look like. And so because if you take a complexity framework, you end up needing to think much more about how do we experiment and adjust and have a whole lot of feedback, which again gets back to questions of social capital and patterns of information flowing in all sorts of different ways in order to be able to manage the complexity that we have developed. So with human society as complex as it is, just in human social terms, and on top of that, we have put this massive physical disruption, introducing all sorts of more kinds of complexity as we mess fundamentally with the physical substrate of our survival, we've ended up in what you could call the Great Acceleration. And you'll see in these next few charts that I'm going to show that we have the 1950s as very much of a tipping point, that's when population really started taking off. Urban population, GDP started accelerating. There's a whole series of them: energy use, methane emissions, carbon emissions, GDP levels, all of which, when you put together, show us that somewhere around in the 1950s or so, this great acceleration just started very rapidly transforming everything that we are doing to the planet and the complexity of the civilization within which we exist. All of this is happening on a very fragile planet. And I think this picture is worth contemplating for a bit, because when we talk about the massive disruptions that we're doing, even just to the atmosphere, even just with climate change, it's a very thin blue line. And it has turned out that we have now entered this period that many are calling the Anthropocene, where we are by far the largest source of physical change on the planet. And that puts us in a situation where we have multiple interacting physical shocks, along with all of the human and social and economic shocks that we've already been talking about, interacting in all sorts of different ways. It's getting referred to as the polycrisis. I've heard it referred to as the long emergency, that we are now in a position where for several generations, because of the physical changes that we've inflicted on the planet, there is going to be a period of volatility that is even greater than the kinds of shocks that human history has seen up to now. This could be pretty problematic. Joseph Tainter, several decades ago, wrote a book called The Collapse of Complex Societies, in which he argued that if you look at why societies have collapsed over the last several millennia, he claims they are pretty much doomed to collapse when they become too complex to manage themselves. And they then collapse back to lesser levels of complexity, greater simplicity. It's a depressing take. It is possible, but I would argue that it's not inevitable, that there are ways to govern complexity for the longer term, and that democracy is much better at this than autocracy because it is much more nimble, decentralized, has better information flows, and that relatively free market capitalism is better than state capitalism for the same reasons. So it's exactly the opposite of the argument that you sometimes hear, that we need someone in control to fix all these problems in a complex society that's inherently impossible. Complexity has to be managed by some decentralized system with a lot of feedback and accountability. But the systems that we currently have are not doing the job. We've turned government into a set of siloed hierarchical bureaucracies. Business at scale tends to operate the same way. Exactly the kinds of institutions that are good at very complicated problems where you can take pieces apart and put them back together and know what the outcome is going to be. They're not good at this much more nimble kind of complexity. So we need a systemic approach that help us to regenerate the forms of capital that we've depleted and that are carried out by people who have an awareness of systems as a whole. This is why I think Joe's call for political capitalism is so crucial. It's essentially systemic thinking for business leaders, along with his call for regulation that aims to create the conditions in which those businesses will be motivated to solve societal problems. I absolutely agree with him. One of the groups that I'm working with, the Economics of Mutuality Foundation, comes out of work that was actually initiated at Mars Incorporated and has now spun off, that is trying to, in very practical terms, help businesses to understand how they make this transition so that they are focused systemically and thinking about broader purpose, is what Joe would call political capitalism. I think this is also why Martin's call for a refocus on citizenship is exactly right. It's systemic thinking for everyone, which I think is badly needed. But it's not just citizenship in the electoral sense, or even in the sense of engaging in social movements to put pressure on government and on business. One thing that I did not see much of in either of these books was much of a focus on civil society as the way in which people come together to self-organize, not through formal structures of government or business, to deal with whatever collective problems they may be facing. It can be bottom up, it can be networked across the globe, it can operate at scale. It can only happen in democracies at scale, because for autocracies, it represents alternative power centers that autocracies can't tolerate. And best of all is if you can get these very different sectors to come together. Because if what we need is to be fostering sustainable economies and promoting human and social development, all while protecting rights, which is the essence of democratic capitalism, we aren't going to be able to do it by any of these sectors acting separately. We do have to be realistic. Governments can be oppressive, business can be extractive, and civil society can be extremely negative. There are all sorts of bad collective action possibilities happening in all these sectors. But at their best, I think this kind of partnership across the three sectors is what really gives us some hope that we can find a way back to a truly democratic capitalism. And let me end it with that.
Thank you very much, Anne. Let me get the discussion going by asking a question which I think is triggered by both what Martin said about Aristotle's middle people and nothing in excess. What we're really talking about is, in some sense, considering a number of balancing acts that in some sense have gone out of whack. Right? In the paper that Anne and I and Gordon LaForge wrote recently, we talk about three aspects of rebalancing: the state versus the market, the labor versus capital, humanity versus nature. Martin puts it as follows: fragile marriage of democracy and capitalism requires maintaining difficult balances between individual and community, private and public, freedom and responsibility, economics and politics, money and ethics, elites and people, citizen, non-citizen, national and global. And Joe argues for an enlightened melding of corporate behavior, politics, and civics. We just had a World Bank report released today by the World Bank saying that, you know, we may have a lost decade. And many of the things that Ayan Kos and his colleagues are talking about is, again, achieving certain kinds of balance for higher investment and so on and so forth. The point I'm trying to make is that what we need to do is reasonably well known. The question is how? How do we actually get to do it? So the burning question is, are there political pathways to obtain solutions? How do we bring about the change that a lot of us think is needed? So let me start with Joe, and then Anne can provide some comments.
Thanks very much. The thing I would say is that, you know, our complex societies are inevitably messy. Progress is not going from place A to place B in a straight line. You know, I kind of compare going in if anybody's into boating here, I compare the difference between having a power boat and having a sailing boat. So, you know, in a power boat, you say, I want to go from place A to place B. This is the nicest straight line. Let's just go. But that's not how we make progress in societies. The way we make progress in societies is like being in a sailing boat in a storm, where you have to tack this way and that, depending on which way the political winds happen to be blowing, where you take water, where you take on water, where you're sometimes pushed backwards and nearly drown, and then make a little bit more further progress, where even the final destination is not agreed upon, but you're kind of trying to tack. So it's messy. And I think when we say, the solutions are well known, I don't think they are. I think we have ideas. I think these are complex issues that maybe don't have solutions, but maybe we can ameliorate. And by the time we've ameliorated them, it's 20 years and new ideas have come up. So the whole thing is a messy process, and we're part of that mess and we contribute to it. But I think, and the other part of the mess is that one of the problems with neoclassical economics is this belief in that there is some kind of stable equilibrium. Well, of course, there never is. Everything is always changing. So I think for those of us who sort of try to think about these things, I would kind of get back to the point you've just made, Sunil. Let's not think in terms of fixing things and solutions, but let's think about, what are the next steps forward that might ameliorate things, and that are actually politically achievable. Because we're all very good at making, detailed analyses of what's wrong and detailed analysis on why the thing isn't working, and then saying, well, here's your 5-point plan to fix it. Well, what we must realize, of course, is that if you put that 5-point plan to 500 million people, many of them will fundamentally disagree with it, because that 5-point plan reflects our own personal political preferences. So that's one thing to bear in mind. The second is, how are we actually going to do this 5-point plan? What are the politics behind it? How do we find viable political pathways to making small things happen? And I think if that for those of us in think tanks and those of you in academia, it would be maybe much more productive to start focusing on, how do we take small steps forward and actually make them happen, than what we tend to do, which is, this is a big complex problem, but I've got the answer in my 5 bullet points, and now it's up to you to get it done. And that is kind of useless. So I think there's a lot for us to learn if we're actually trying to help move things forward.
Ann, go ahead.
I could not agree more with everything Joe just said, and you just pulled the rug out from under most of the think tank industry. So I find it very refreshing. Let me take the opposite side of this, which is, what are the kinds of very concrete things that can be done? And I want to take an example that's happening right now in the United States that's just getting started, that comes out of the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the miracle legislation we got last summer, and many of us are still wondering, how on earth did that happen? It seems like divine intervention, but of course it wasn't. It was a whole lot of people doing a whole lot of work, and we got lucky. The Inflation Reduction Act, despite its name, is primarily about funding a green transition, using a whole bunch of very clever mechanisms, many of which are using the tax code, but some of which is direct funding. One of the things that has been a high priority for the Biden administration is the notion of environmental justice in bringing about this transition. And it is the Inflation Reduction Act has tens of billions of dollars specifically set aside to go to marginalized communities that have been the frontline communities that have suffered the environmental consequences of where does the dirty stuff get cited, and they're on the most marginal land. So when climate change does strike, they are the ones who suffer the most. With that money moving, and it's moving fast because of the American election cycles, things need to get done before the other party comes back into power, if it does. How do you move tens of billions of dollars to communities that, by definition, don't have a whole lot in the way of capacity, because they are the ones who have been marginalized? The thinking has been, the old way of thinking has been, these are grants that come from the federal government that communities have to apply for in a very complex process, very difficult to do. Anyone who's ever gotten US government money realizes that it is a full-time job just to figure out how you get the money. So what a number of us at New America and elsewhere are exploring is, can we use the fact that this money is moving into these communities not only as a way of trying to deal with climate change mitigation and adaptation, but as a way of rejuvenating democracy from the ground up? There are community development financial institutions, there are community colleges, there's a whole set network of possible actors that can take the fact that we're getting this once in a generation opportunity to remake America in these communities, to solve a very massive democratic deficit that has persisted for a very long time, and to deal with one of the fundamental challenges of the 21st century, which is the degree to which we are disrupting the climate. There are things that can be done, and it can be done very specifically. So Joe, I totally agree with your argument that we spend way too much time talking about what are the big policy solutions and far too little time on the practicalities of what do you do on the ground to fix these problems. And I see.
Thanks very much, Anne. And we're grateful to have Martin back, and we should allow him to continue with his presentation.
So my basic argument is, as I was saying, that capitalism and democracy are complementary opposites. They have values in common. People matter. Individuals matter. They have agency both in politics and in their own lives. But of course, capitalism and democracy are also opposites in some very fundamental ways, in that capitalism may notionally have egalitarian premises. Anybody can get involved in the market, but of course it has highly inegalitarian outcomes. And one of the most important consequences of that fact, of course, is it can throw up and does throw up plutocracies. Plutocracies use their wealth to dominate the power in the political system, subverting democracy. And that, I argue, not original, leads to populist reactions of various kinds. And this can lead to autocracy, plutocracy, come autocracy, or autocracy, which is notionally against plutocracy and just creates a new plutocracy, as we're seeing, say, in Venezuela today. So the democratic capitalism is very fragile. Historically, I believe the economic developments of the 19th and early 20th centuries in the developed world created very powerful political forces for democracy, but they were very far from omnipotent or all-powerful. As we know, just look what happened in Europe in the middle of the first half of the 20th century. And it remains the case that the economy is not necessarily going to help us create the conditions for a stable democratic order. And I suppose the main theme of my book, analytically, and I'll sort of go through a couple of charts and then I'll end this discussion, illustrates this. And I'll illustrate this in three very simple charts. So this chart shows one of the most profound economic processes of the last half a century, which is deindustrialization, the reduction in the significance of the industrial working class in all our societies. It varies in levels, and it varies in the degree to which it declined. By the way, the US decline in the share of employment in the labor market, which is in industry, was more or less exactly median. As you can see, there are far more extreme cases. And one of the most interesting facts is deindustrialization measured in this way has been very high in Germany, even though it has a huge surplus in trade. So it's not so simple to relate to.
Okay, I think the internet is gone again, so we got the final say from Martin.
It's actually fairly ironic. He is talking about the deindustrialization of Britain, and we are seeing something related happening live.
Yes.
Yes.
Right.
No, to me, it's the relationships that you make on the internet are not as strong as the relationships that you make in person and by interacting with people. So I think here's another illustration of that it always pays to be there physically in person rather than connecting through the internet. But anyway, there you have it. So let me continue with the discussion. And I think this, again, follows up with what Martin just said. If you think about the political economy, there was even a more fundamental fracture that I think Joe alluded to, because in the neoliberal era, what we had was an intellectual and corporate elite that was trying to keep the economy separate from the politics. And eventually the political elite also buys into this into the system to keep the economic system separate from the political system. There was a sense that economic activity had to be protected from an interference, or any interference, including of democratic accountability. Now, clearly, that is not, as we are seeing, sustainable, because economics and politics in many ways are part and parcel of the system, which is inextricably joined. So the question is, how did we come to this? What was the role of universities and the educational institutions in both in trying to evolve and justify this set of assumptions?
Do you want me to take that? Start?
Sure. So you can start, and then we'll have Anne and even Remy can chip in.
So as our societies became more complex, people specialized. And as I like to say, we got into this idea where we valued deep expertise rather than breadth. The kind of the old idea of the Renaissance man, the old idea of somebody who has an overview of the complex system, that gave way to a deification almost of how much more you know about your ever narrower subject. And to an extent that was necessary, because everything became much more complicated, a lot more stuff coming out. So people, what we started to value, both in academia and in society in general, is people who are expert in narrow fields. I like to say people who know more and more about less and less is what we started to value. And what we lost is the idea that for that to work, we also have to have some mechanism where we can bring all this expertise together and people who understand the interactions of a complex system. And that was lost for a long time. But now I think it's coming back. People are realizing that, and we're starting to put it, we're starting to realize that expertise and that mindset is necessary, but it's going to take a while to get it back. The other thing I think is that the rise of the expert also led us to believe that there are right answers to everything. And there aren't. I mean, and also I think we maybe, I would suggest that we may misinterpret things. So back to Ann's comment about the Inflation Reduction Act, I would question whether climate change was actually the biggest driver of that, or whether political and industrial competition with China was the biggest driver that actually made it happen. You know, my vote is for the latter. So your point, Sunil, you know, I always thought of economics as a branch of politics. You know, there is no economic statement that doesn't have political content and that is not based on some sort of political ideology. So when we talk about things like justice and rights, people with different political persuasions will interpret those terms in fundamentally different ways, which is why we need this dialectic and why we have people pulling in different directions.
Anne?
I have a lot to say about higher education, but first, just a little bit of a pushback on Joe.
Yeah.
I think there were three huge pieces of legislation that went through last year: the CHIPS Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the IRA. The first two, I absolutely agree with you. This was driven by the kinds of political considerations you're talking about. The IRA went through on a pure party vote. And if, in fact, part of the motivation for it was competition with China more than focus around the increasingly obvious damages that climate change is causing to the country, I think we would have had a better chance of having something that was truly, at least a little bit around the edges, bipartisan. So I think in this particular case, yes, of course, one of the considerations is, are we keeping up with China in the green transition? But even more, it's that it's beyond the point of being able to ignore it. It is so much in our face now. And the opportunities for doing things about it are too great to ignore. So, minor point. Major point is, I think higher education has a great deal to answer for in having sent us on this reductionist path to such an extreme and sticking with it now long past the point at which it should have been past its sell-by date. I think this may be even more true in the social sciences than it is in the physical sciences, because the physical sciences have a reality check underlying them inherently. But in the social sciences in particular, and really academia across the board, we're in a world in which your rankings as a university depend on how many articles your faculty get into a certain substrate of journals. And those journals have a stranglehold on what counts as good research. That stranglehold in some cases is not justified. It is a system in which people are then pressured to salami slice whatever they are working on to the smallest possible pieces so they can get the largest number of publications out of it. This is not a system for dealing with a complex, interconnected world that is going through the kind of poly crisis that we are currently encountering. It also has one other really significant implication, which is that the people who are teaching, not just the next generation, all of the executive education and all the mid-career professional training and all the rest of it, have been socialized into this system where you are rewarded for your narrow expertise. And so we are training people in ways that really do not make a whole lot of sense. And let me just give you one example of that. When I was teaching in Singapore, I was at one point teaching a course on global issues, and a student who was a finance major cross-registered and took the course because she had broader interests. And of course, her finance courses were doing a whole lot of case studies because this was a business-oriented program. And she came to me one day and said that she had gone to her finance professor saying that she wanted to incorporate some of what I was teaching in global issues, this broader perspective on what's the state of the world, what's happening into her analysis of one of the finance cases. And he told her that if she did so, he would fail her. That she was forbidden to think beyond the very narrow confines of what he had decided finance was supposed to be about. There are, of course, lots of people in academia who have done heroic things to try to overcome this. But it takes quite a lot of doing. The master's program that Sunil mentioned that I created in Singapore was one such effort that was focused around mid-career professionals from all the sectors. How do you bring them together to have an understanding of complexity, an understanding of the state of the world, and what their respective roles are with each other and how they understand each other? But Joe, as you point out in your book, the MBAs are by and large not doing this. The public policy schools are by and large not explaining how it is that public policy has to engage with civil society and with business. And I think there is a wide open opportunity right now for higher education to rethink itself. It's had to do so to some degree because of the pandemic anyhow, but to really be thinking about how do we train not just the next generation, but the current generation, current executives, current leaders, current community leaders at scale, rapidly, about this whole complex of issues that we're talking about.
Great, thanks very much. And Remy, do you want to add something?
No, maybe we should take the questions from the Q&A. Okay. I just want to make sure we finish on time. Thank you.
Okay, great. Paul Barnett has raised a number of questions on complexity and the nonlinearity of our system that I think got answered by both Joe and Ann. But there's a question that Ajay Chibber raises about the balance between state and market. In some sense, we're trying to traverse between the limits of what the market can do and what the state can do. And in many ways, people think that the state has become either too large or is overburdened by responsibilities. The question is, how do we attain the right balance? I mean, how large should the state be? It's not a question that we can answer a priori, but I mean, through experience and through what we see in many different countries, how do we come to an assessment of whether we're getting the balance between the state and market correct?
Do you want me to just have a bash?
Have a bash.
How do you figure out what the balance should be between state and market? I want to keep insisting it's not state and market. It is government, business, and civil society. That those actually act. And I think it's really important that we not keep leaving out civil society. Part of the figures that were in Ajay's question showed the differences between societies that have a heavier reliance on civil society, as in the United States, versus societies that don't. Actually, Joe, this is building on a conversation you and I had earlier, that going back to Tocqueville, there has just been more self-organization happening in the US and therefore less of a burden on government than in some other countries. I want to twist the question a little bit because I think part of it is a question of proportion. Part of it is also a question of sheer scale, that we now have governments that not only have taken over a much larger set of responsibilities for society, and I think those responsibilities are growing, not decreasing, but they're also just governing a whole lot more people doing a whole lot more things. And I think one really serious question is, are there scale limits to the size that a polity can be? I don't know how you answer that question. I do know that this is why I am very fearful for the future of China, because not only do they operate at such a scale, but they are trying to operate in a relatively centralized way at such a scale, which just seems impossible. But even for a country like the United States, as wildly decentralized as it is, may just be getting too big for our centralized systems to be able to cope with.
So let me be more pointed to in terms of the question that Ajay has asked. What he's asking is, does the change and variation in the size of government make any difference to the performance of democratic capitalism and the rise of populism? Does the size of the government?
Yes. It can give some responses. Well, it obviously makes a difference to the performance, but again, the question is causality. So, the increase in the size of government has evolved as part of the demands that we're making on government. So, we have growing welfare systems, we spend money on defense, and we now want to spend more money on defense because we believe that the world is becoming a more dangerous place. We want to invest in education, et cetera. So the demands on government. So it's democratic. It's the democratic system itself that has evolved in a way that has increased the size of government. It's what it's what the polity has to some extent demanded by electing people who have done that. So it's and I don't believe there's a right number, 20%, 30%, 40%. Again, there is no equilibrium. What we've seen in the post-war world and until now is that the political system and our political debate and our political conflict of different views has resulted in the size of government increasing everywhere. And so it's a result of that. If you take, I'm making an assumption here, and I don't know if AJ's question is correct, a suggestion that government is, at least the way I read it, that government has grown too big, the people are fed up of that, and therefore they elect populist politicians. Well, they might elect populist politicians, and those populist politicians might promise to drain the swamp and might promise to get rid of lots of government stuff and make lean government and whatever. But when they were in office, they did exactly the opposite. Boris Johnson showered people with money. I received a check a couple of years back saying with the compliments of Donald J. Trump. I can't even remember what it was for. It was COVID or something, some kind of handout. So it's all very well to sort of fire the people up and say we have to get rid of, all this government expenditure. But if you look at all the populists around the world, or the people, I don't like the word populist, by the way, but the people we have chosen to label as populists, whether that's in France, whether that's in the UK, whether that's in the United States, whether it's anywhere else, they've all promised to drain the swamp, and then when they got in power, they've spent more money. It's always the same.
So we got one last question. Steve Kaplan asks, how can international institutions provide national governments with more room to maneuver to meet the social capital needs of their domestic population? Is there scope for a new embedded liberalism?
So just a little bit of translation here for any in the audience who aren't familiar with the term embedded liberalism, but it comes out of work that John Ruggie did decades ago, focused around the question of how is it that you had, essentially, how did you have democratic capitalism for several decades after World War II? And it went into some detail about the kinds of things that we've been talking about here, that you have to have a political system that meets people's needs and protects them from the vagaries of the market. And part of why the United Nations at one point had created the Global Compact was this idea of we need a new embedded liberalism for the world order as a whole. This is something that was launched in the 1990s. Yes, it is needed. How international institutions can help to bring that about is, I think, a bit problematic. I mean, the UN tried creating a global compact that would get the business sector that works globally working with others to think about changing the world of business. And I think you can do that with business and with civil society. I don't know how you do this with governments, because governments by nature are so nationally focused. For international institutions to give them space, for smaller countries that are more dependent on support from international institutions, yes, they can just literally not be quite so hard-headed about what they require from them. But in terms of contributing to the global order as a whole, that's harder to see.
So let me ask one last question to both of you before we conclude. There's a huge discussion of ESG and corporations are the most powerful private entities in democratic capitalism. They utilize, as you've both said, varieties of capital. And any money generation that takes place which does not regenerate this capital, or at least not destroy it, is clearly not sustainable in the long haul. And you can see that even the discussion about corporate governance in the US is highly politically charged, and I presume it's in other countries too. So the question is, how do you change corporate behavior? How in some fundamental way do you change the narrative?
Can I start responding?
Yes, please, Joe.
I just want to make one point about the previous question before I respond, which is that the question posed by Stephen here comes across to me as I see the world a little bit the other way around. It's, international institutions have not been elected by anybody. Where democratic legitimacy lies is in national governments. They may choose to delegate some functions, some shared functions to international institutions, but international institutions should be subordinate, not ruling, because they don't have democratic legitimacy of national governments. So to me, it's the flow has to be the other way around. But anyway, let's pass on from that to corporations. ESG, ESG is kind of the fashionable term of the moment, and unfortunately has been converted to a tick box exercise of, can I score high, if I paint my boardroom green, will I score higher on the MSCI ESG index? But, I think that this whole discussion about ESG is simply a manifestation that societal expectations of business are changing, as are political expectations of business. Now, it's not uniform, and as I said before, there's a lot of argument about it. So ESG is just one simple manifestation of that. And businesses are responding to that because they're getting pressure from activists, they're getting pressure from their own customers, they're getting pressure from governments, they're getting pressure from their shareholders, they're getting pressures from all sorts of stakeholders. So I think that businesses are responding to all these things and do have an understanding that the world has changed. Of course, for some of them, it's changed in a very scary way. There was a CEO interviewed in Davos who said, 5 years ago, we never had to deal with all this stuff. And frankly, it's very scary. They're not used to having to deal with this stuff. So let's also be realistic about how quickly people can pivot. If you're running a corporation scattered across the world with 200,000 employees, you can't turn on a dime. So this is complex and it's going to take time.
Great, Joe, thanks very much. And you have 30 seconds if you want to respond to that.
Okay, I'll respond with an anecdote. When the Sustainable Development Goals came out in 2015, I shortly after was having lunch with the CEO of a major corporation in Southeast Asia, just chance, just us. And before we even sat down at the table, he said to me, "Thank God for the SDGs. Now I know what I'm supposed to do. Like, here's a set of quantitative indicators." Of course, he thought he could pick two and do those things and forget everything else, which is a bit problematic. So I think the final concluding point I want to make is that we need, in these complex problems that we're facing, we need to be looking for the things that can tip the system out of the very degenerative state that it's in into one that regenerates the things that we need. That's why I think Joe's book is so extraordinarily important, because he's pointing to one of those, which is transforming the role of business and how we can do that. And I think another we have picked on is the role of higher education, which needs to do the same.
Great, thanks very much. I think with that, we've run out of time. Let me just say that we really are in a very complex world. It is a complex adaptive system. It's not in a good state of affairs. And what we've tried to do here is discuss in how we can sort of nudge it. We don't have complete control, but we have to nudge it onto a better path that we all desire. And with the climate crisis upon us, maybe we have less time than we thought we did. So with that, thank you very much to the entire panel. Thank you also very much to Martin for his intermittent participation. And thank you, everyone who's participated today. A good day to everyone. Thank you.